Okay, welcome back. Let's talk about pressure and how this is going to be instrumental in getting behaviors from your dog. We've talked about positive reinforcement, and if you've already begun to work with your dog at an early phase, you're pretty much stuffing your dog's face with food. That's positive reinforcement. We are rewarding the dog for a behavior that we want in order to make that behavior stronger over time. That's the conditioning process, right? This is the opposite of it. If that's the positive, this is the negative. The application of pressure. Some people refer to it as punishment. I don't see it as punishment. I don't like to think of it as something aversive, which is typically what punishment is for me, or the way that I define it. I see this as a means of getting your dog to do a behavior because they want to be able to avoid the pressure that is going to come from not doing the behavior, right? So it's a negative consequence. In other words, the positive is I am doing the behavior because I'm getting a reward, such as the food that you're going to stick in my face or in my mouth. And the other is I'm going to do the behavior because I want to be able to avoid the pressure that is going to come if I do not do the behavior, okay? So going through this very quickly, there are a variety of ways in which you can apply pressure to a dog, which is really not much different than the way that we apply pressure to children, to ourselves, the way society applies pressure to us. But for the sake of your training, you want to think about voice, spatial, leash, and touch pressure. Now, there's pressure from the remote collar as well, but I'm going to set that aside because I'll have a different conversation about that, and that is a temporary thing. However long that temporary is, it can be a month, it could be 6 months, it could be a year or so. At some point, ideally, you're going to phase away from the remote collar, and your means of applying pressure to your dog are really basically coming from you, from how you speak to your dog, how you address your dog, how you touch your dog, and how you move into your dog's space. So very quickly, voice is your primary means of applying pressure. And when we teach certain cues, such as, and if you've looked at the earlier videos, such as good, which is again the positive, and no, which is the negative, there are different ways in which you want to be able to communicate those simple cues to your dog. So for example, good is a light-hearted tone. Good. And then no should be firmer, should be strict. The no should imply there's pressure of some kind, right? So it's good and no. Good and no. Sometimes I get people who tell me when I deal with a couple, for example, well, the dog listens to my husband or my boyfriend more than they do to the wife or the girlfriend, for example. They sometimes think that the male, has an added ability to deal with animals. But usually what happens is that we men have a deeper tone of voice and sometimes a more assertive way of speaking, for lack of a better term. And that is pressure. So the dog recognizes that. So the dog may feel more pressure from one person versus another. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the person's ability or skill as a trainer. Some of the very best trainers in the world that I follow are women. But they have learned the proper application of certain cues that are conditioned within the dog, and knowing how to speak those cues in a manner that tells the dog, this is good, you're going to get a reward, or this is serious, you want to stop that behavior, or I'm going to start putting pressure on you. And if you think about this, if you have children, or even if you don't have children, you've had parents in the past, our way of speaking to our children, and when we want to give them a good reward and reinforce and encourage what they're doing versus stopping a behavior, falls exactly along these lines, knowing how to apply that pressure. The difference is, and this is an important difference, is that when we do this with other people, when we do this with children, it's almost like a subconscious thing. We don't think about it. We just naturally speak nicely and a little higher in tone and a higher pitch when we are trying to give something to someone or gain something from someone, right? We're trying to appease someone, and then we speak in a lower, more firm tone when we feel like someone's crossing the line, or we want to be able to stop a certain behavior, or we want to really, again, assert ourselves. And with dogs, you want to be conscious of how you're talking about, or rather, how you're trying to communicate to your dog verbally. So we've talked in other videos how you are going to kind of do away with all those sentences and all the chatty conversation that we have with dogs. And that is very important because we don't want to get into whole conversations with dogs. It's meaningless to them. We want to teach them a set of cues, or a dozen or so cues, if even that is conditioned within the dog, and the dog knows the meaning behind those cues. But how we speak those cues is incredibly important as well. It's not just a matter of speaking the cue. It's knowing how to speak the cue in order to get the dog to comply with what we are trying to get the dog to do. The other one is spatial pressure. Think about a person who, doesn't matter whether it's a stranger or someone who you know very well, who comes into what we define as our personal space. That space where it's just, think of them just like nose to nose. Immediately that puts a form of pressure within us. And our almost instinctive reaction is just to pull back. It's no different with dogs, okay? So it's a form of putting pressure on a dog. When I'm trying to get a dog into a place, for example, and I'm working on duration, meaning that I want the dog to stay there for a prolonged period of time, there are times that the dog is going to try to get out, right? And provided that I have done my work and the dog does understand what the place cue means, I can give him a very sharp and firm no, and even get up to walk into his personal space. That's a form, those are two combined forms of pressure that tell the dog, okay, I need to do this. I need to get right back into my place, okay? And leash is another form. If you're doing a structured walk, you have a way of applying leash pressure on a dog and trying to get a certain behavior, either a certain positioning with the dog or getting your dog to sit. Okay, those are ways of putting pressure on the dog with leash. And sometimes I use touch, although not very often. But an example is when I'm walking with the dog in a structured way. And for example, when I do deal with many reactive dogs, and the dog goes over threshold, and I'm trying to get them into a sit position, and they're having a great deal of trouble because their body is just impulsively giving into that emotional state that they get into when they see another dog or whatever they perceive to be a threat, right? I put leash pressure on them, so I may pull the leash up, and then I will gently tap their bum, their rump, their rear end, and bring that down. So that's a form of touching that puts pressure on them, and I combine that with leash pressure as well. I'll also tell them no. I'll give them that sharp no. And I may even apply some spatial pressure. It's just like an immediate reaction is the dog goes over threshold, for example, just to illustrate. I will immediately say no and put that pressure on the leash, maybe go into the dog's spatial space, right into that personal space, and then put a little pressure on the bum to get that dog to sit. So I've used all four ways of getting the dog to do what I want by applying pressure judiciously and timely. So it's important that you know exactly the ways in which you can apply pressure to the dog, but that you practice. Again, this is one of those things where this has to be second nature to you. And this is one of those things, one of those learning curves that you have to go through. Don't think that just because you know exactly what these are and you've done this in the past, that it's going to be second nature to you when you need to do it with your dog. So if your dog has done a board and train with me, then I can guarantee you your dog knows exactly what these forms of pressure are, because I've applied them and used them with your dog in some way, and your dog will give into them. In many instances, one of the things that I teach is a firm no. I condition the dog to understand what no means. And you can see me from a distance talking to a dog who is maybe trying to drink dirty water. I'll give him a firm no, and the dog will pull away because he understands that's my form of communicating with him. Negative consequences about to come, and it's a form of pressure. Okay, so all of these need to be second nature for you. And the truth of the matter is that you will continue to fumble and fumble and fumble if they are not second nature to you. Now, I also get many people who will tell me, well, I do this all the time with my dogs. My dog does something that I don't want, and I'll yell at him, I'll flip out at him, and he'll stop sometimes. He was on the counter the other day, and I pushed him away firmly, and he stopped. But then they do it again. They come back, and he does the same behavior all over again. Why is that? Well, for a few reasons. Number one is that, I'm going to write this down, conditioning, and meaning that the dog is not really understanding what it is that you want him to do instead of the unwanted and undesirable behavior that you're getting. You may get a dog who is counter surfing, and you may be pushing him away, and you're giving him a negative consequence, but it's not necessarily teaching him that he shouldn't be doing it. You're not giving him an alternative behavior. You don't always need to give your dog an alternative behavior. But in this instance, here's two other things that are missing, which are crucial. One is timing, and the other one is consistency. Now, these are incredibly important here. Now, when your dog does, again, a board and train with me, and even if it's not a board and train, even if we're doing the in-home sessions in the 45-day program, the whole process of training the dog is to condition the dog towards certain behaviors. So when your dog comes to you, and when your dog waits patiently by an open doorway, or when your dog goes to a designated spot like place, that's all conditioning, okay? If you're doing the in-home program, you've done a lot of work, a lot of repetitions to get that dog to do the behavior. And that's the conditioning process. That's what you're doing. You're conditioning the dogs to understand exactly what the cue means. And you are doing so many drills and so many repetitions. Your purpose in doing so is to make it second nature for the dog. You don't want the dog to think when you say, hey, spot, come, or spot, place. You don't want the dog to be in a state of confusion in terms of what exactly is it that you're asking of me. Your dog, through a heck of a lot of repetition and drills, is being conditioned to understand what you're asking of him. So conditioning becomes an integral part of training. But here's the important thing to pressure, whether it's a negative or a positive consequence that you're dishing out, such as the food, right? Or a negative consequence, which is a form of pressure. Timing is incredibly important. The best trainers in the world are incredibly good with timing. Dogs don't learn long term down the road. So, for example, your dog, it doesn't serve you if you're trying to teach a dog like a sit, for example. It doesn't serve you to teach your dog to sit and get your dog to sit and then reinforce that sit 5 minutes later, because the dog doesn't make the connection between the reward and the behavior that you are trying to pair up that reward with. It has to be instantaneous. In other words, in that example, when the butt hits the ground, you instantly stuff that dog's face. That's exactly what you're looking for with timing. Okay, so timing has to be, and the opposite is true. I mean, also with negative, not just the positive, but the negative is just as important. When the dog does something that you do not want, the application of pressure has to be like spot on, like instantaneous. Because again, it's all, as I've said in earlier videos, about the dog forming an association and being conditioned in a certain manner. And if the dog doesn't get that either positive or the negative instantaneous, he doesn't make that connection. He doesn't think in terms of pairing one thing with another. It doesn't make sense to him. So it has to be like instantly. The dog has to do something, and then has to be an immediate consequence to that behavior, whether that consequence is good or negative. Okay, and only if it's timely will the dog understand it. Now the other part, and this is where most people fail, consistency. And in the example that I was saying, where people get ticked off at their dogs and they yell at their dogs, they push their dogs, and they think that momentarily they get a result, and they wonder why the dog continues to do the behavior again afterwards, is because, again, their timing may be on point. So the dog does something and they may be giving some kind of negative consequence immediately, but they're not consistent. They're not consistent. Their negative consequence is based upon their emotional state. Well, I'm pissed off now, so now I'm going to yell at the dog. Now I'm going to stop the dog. Or I have tolerated this long enough, now I no longer tolerate it, and now I'm going to do something about it. Maybe next time the dog does it, I'll tolerate it a little longer, but then when my tolerance level gets a little too high, then I'm going to stop it. It's not consistent. So what happens is that the dog begins to randomize the behavior that you're trying to stop him to do. So in other words, he'll figure out, sometimes I get away with it, sometimes I don't, which means I'm going to continue to try to see if this time I get away with it, right? So it is important that you not only get really super familiar with the way of applying pressure with the dog. And when I say familiar, it's not academic. You want to be like, this has to be physical. This has to be part of you. Like you shouldn't even have to think about it. Your dog does something and no, not only the cue, but the form of speaking to him and knowing when to go into his space or knowing when to put some pressure on him with the leash, right? So timing has to be immaculate. It has to be like spot on. Boom. But you also have to be consistent. It's got to be, you've got to be consistent, which is why I really stress that everything that your dog does in training, whether it's a board and train or whether it's the in-home program, you're getting a dog to go to a designated spot, or you're getting a dog to come to you each and every single time, or wait patiently by an open doorway, or wait patiently for his or her food. All of these need to be lifestyle things, lifestyle skills, lifestyle habits, lifestyle standards. They can't be sometimes things, because if you sometimes allow it and sometimes you don't, again, the dog randomizes the behavior, and then that's exactly what you will get. You will get the behavior sometimes, and sometimes you won't. So consistency is everything. It's everything. You've got to live by the standard that you are trying to set your dog to live by, in other words, okay? So I hope that this makes some sense. We'll talk about this more in person, one-on-one, when we see each other, but give this some thought, and this is something you also want to practice. Whether you want to practice it with your dog, you want to practice it with a spouse, a boyfriend, girlfriend, your kids, it's something that you want to start being more conscious of and thinking of, because we do all of these things. Again, it's just subconsciously. We just don't think about it. So give it some thought. All right, I hope that helps. Let's go on to the next video.